Welcome back, deep divers. Today, buckle up, because we're diving headfirst into the quantum realm with, well, a bit of a complicated figure, Johannes Stark.
Yeah, he's a real head-scratcher, isn't he? Brilliant physicist, absolutely. But some of his choices, well, let's just say they cast a pretty dark shadow over his legacy.
No kidding. Luckily, we've got a fantastic essay by Jorgo Schneppat as our roadmap for this deep dive, and he really doesn't hold back. We're talking scientific achievements, controversies, and the whole messy intersection of science and, well, politics.
It's a good reminder that science, it's not always this pure objective pursuit. There are real people behind those discoveries with all their flaws and passions.
Exactly. So to really understand Johannes Stark, we need to rewind a bit, back to the late 19th, early 20th century. Picture this. Physics is in the midst of a total revolution. X-rays just burst onto the scene. Quantum theory is starting to bubble up. It's a wild time to be a scientist.
Schneppat paints this picture of a scientific landscape just buzzing with energy, with these fundamental ideas about the universe being challenged and reshaped left and right.
And right in the thick of it, you've got Johannes Stark, born in a small Bavarian village. Schneppat really emphasizes how his humble beginnings almost fueled this burning ambition to leave his mark on the world, through science.
It's like this classic tale of the underdog, but with a pretty complicated ending, as we'll see.
So this ambitious kid ends up at, the University of Munich, which back then was like the epicenter of physics research. Can you imagine being in a lecture hall with, say, Wilhelm Röntgen, fresh off discovering X-rays? What an atmosphere.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time. And according to Schneppat, those influences, especially Röntgen's, were pretty huge on Stark. But what's interesting is this. Stark, from the get-go, was all about experimental physics. Like, give him a lab, give him some equipment, and he was in his element. He actually had this skepticism towards, purely theoretical stuff. Always wanted to see things, to test things with his own hands.
This whole hands-on approach, it really leads to his big breakthrough, right? It's 1913. He's messing around with electric fields and spectral lines. That thing where when you excite an atom, it emits light, and if you pass that light through a prism, you get these specific lines, like a fingerprint for each element.
Oh yeah, classic spectroscopy. It was a huge deal back then. Still is, actually.
Right. But what Stark does is he applies an electric field to these excited atoms, and bam. The spectral lines, they split. This is the famous Stark effect. And it basically threw the physics world for a loop.
It's like, imagine you're looking at the spectrum of, hydrogen, and suddenly, instead of one neat line, you see multiple lines under the influence of the electric field. It's like discovering a hidden dimension, a deeper structure within the atom.
Exactly. And what this Stark effect basically proved was a fundamental concept in quantum physics. Electrons and atoms, they don't just hang out wherever they want. They occupy specific energy levels. And not only that, but these levels can be messed with, manipulated by external fields.
It's like the spectral lines were a code, and Stark just cracked it wide open, revealing this whole new layer of complexity in the atomic world.
Huge implications, right? Think about it. Before this, spectroscopy was basically just observing the natural frequencies atoms emitted. Now suddenly you've got a tool to probe, to interact with those frequencies.
And it's not just some theoretical curiosity either. This discovery opened up a whole new avenue for studying the building blocks of matter, and not just studying them, but manipulating them.
And Schneppat makes it clear. This discovery, it catapults Stark into the scientific stratosphere. In 1919, he gets the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on the Stark effect. Talk about a career high point.
It really is. But, and here's where things get, tricky. That Nobel Prize also kind of marks this turning point in Stark's life. You start to see his personal beliefs, his ideology, overshadowing his scientific brilliance.
Yeah, that's the bummer, right?
Yeah.
You think you're getting this feel-good science story, and then, bam, enter Nazis.
And it gets even more complicated because, as Schneppat lays out, Stark becomes a big-time supporter of the Nazi regime, and his ideas about science get all tangled up in their ideology.
And that's where this whole Deutsche Physik thing comes in, right?
Exactly. Schneppat dives deep into this movement, which basically aimed to create this purely German physics, free of what they considered, quote-unquote, Jewish influences. Like, they even went after Einstein's theory of relativity, labeling it Jewish physics. Can you believe that?
It's crazy how ideology can try to warp even something like science, which is supposed to be about, objective truth.
And the tragedy here is that Stark, this pioneer of modern physics, becomes a major player in this movement. Instead of using his influence to push science forward, he's using it to persecute other scientists who, well, didn't fit into their narrow view of what science should be.
So here we are with this incredibly complex legacy on our hands. On the one hand, you've got Stark's undeniable contribution to physics with the Stark effect, a discovery that still has a huge impact today. But then on the other hand, there's his active participation in a movement that tried to undermine scientific progress and basically persecute scientists based on their ethnicity. Talk about a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, it's a tough one for sure. And Schneppat, I think he does a great job of wrestling with this duality throughout his essay. He doesn't shy away from those tough questions, those moral gray areas.
And speaking of gray areas, maybe the most, in-your-face example of this conflict is Stark's rivalry with Werner Heisenberg, another, absolute titan of quantum physics.
Oh man, yeah. Their rivalry was, well, legendary. But it wasn't just about science, right? You had clashing personalities, ideologies, ambition, all of that swirling around in this, pressure cooker of the Nazi era.
Schneppat really goes into the nitty-gritty of their beef, pointing out how Stark, always the show-me-the-data kind of guy, really butted heads with Heisenberg's approach to quantum mechanics, which was, let's face it, super abstract, super mathematical.
It's like they represented these two fundamentally different ways of approaching, the mysteries of the quantum world. Stark, the pragmatist, always grounded in the concrete. He just couldn't wrap his head around the more, philosophical side of Heisenberg's work.
Of course, this was Nazi Germany, so disagreeing with Stark wasn't just like an academic debate. This guy had real power, and he wasn't afraid to use it to, make life pretty miserable for his scientific opponents, especially if they were Jewish.
And Schneppat, he doesn't sugarcoat this at all. He talks about how Stark even labeled Heisenberg a white Jew, which, is just absurd. Heisenberg wasn't Jewish at all. But, in Stark's mind, anyone who opposed his views, anyone who challenged his authority was basically an enemy.
It's a reminder of how easily science can get, hijacked by those in power, twisted to fit their own agenda, their own ideology.
Absolutely. And what's kind of wild, though, is that despite all of Stark's efforts to discredit Heisenberg, to undermine him, Heisenberg's work on quantum mechanics, it ended up being, monumental. The uncertainty principle, for example, that's still a cornerstone of how we understand the quantum world today. It's like science, even in the face of all this, political pressure, ideological BS, it still finds a way to shine through.
It's pretty powerful when you think about it. So with Johannes Stark, we're left with this, how should I put it, this really messy legacy. You can't deny his brilliance, his contribution to physics with the Stark effect, which, by the way, is still super relevant today. But then you've got this whole Deutsche Physik thing. His active role in, basically persecuting other scientists is like this constant tug of war between his scientific brilliance and his dark side.
It really is. And Schneppat, he doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He just lays it all out there and leaves us wrestling with this question. How do we reconcile the brilliance of a scientific mind with the ugliness of prejudice, of complicity?
And it's a question that goes way beyond just Johannes Stark, right? It forces us to acknowledge that science, even with its whole quest for objective truth, it's still a human endeavor, driven by people with all their, virtues and flaws.
Yeah, and I think that leads to an even bigger question, and this is one that Schneppat sort of hints at throughout the essay. How do we make sure that science, this incredibly powerful tool for understanding, for shaping our world, is used ethically, responsibly?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
But maybe, just maybe, by understanding the complexities of figures like Johannes Stark, grappling with their successes and their failures, we can start to figure out how to use science for good, to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.
I think that's a great point. Learning from history, that's the first step, right? And Schneppat, he really gives us a lot to chew on there.
For sure. But, for now, let's bring it back to Stark. Schneppat ends his essay by kind of reflecting on the impact of Stark's work, especially the Stark effect, which, despite everything, has had this incredible ripple effect throughout science.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, right? Even though his political views were, abhorrent, his scientific discoveries, they're still pushing science forward today. It's almost like the universe itself is saying, hey, this knowledge, it's bigger than any one person, bigger than their prejudices.
It's almost poetic when you think about it.
Yeah.
And, on a more practical level, the Stark effect has played a key role in the development of lasers, which, come on, lasers, they're everywhere, revolutionizing everything from communication to medicine.
It's a powerful reminder that scientific knowledge, once it's out there, it has this way of breaking free from its origins, from its creators, and finding its own path, often in ways that no one could have predicted.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like all this knowledge, this quest for understanding, it keeps going, even if the people involved, well, even if they make some pretty terrible choices along the way.
Yeah, it's humbling for sure. And Schneppat, I think he leaves us with this sense of cautious optimism, yeah, Stark's story is a cautionary tale, a big flashing warning sign about what happens when ideology tries to muscle its way into science. But it also shows us that science itself, the pursuit of knowledge, it's got this resilience, this ability to kind of self-correct, to keep pushing forward no matter what.
It's like even when individual scientists stumble, maybe even fall, the quest for understanding, that keeps going.
Exactly. And I think that's the real takeaway from Schneppat's essay. Stark's story, it's not just some, historical footnote. It's like a mirror reflecting these ongoing challenges, these questions we still haven't fully answered about the relationship between science and society, about how we make sure science is used for good.
So where do we go from here? I mean, Sneppat doesn't give us a step-by-step guide, but he does make it clear that we can't just sit back and, hope for the best. We have to be engaged, ask tough questions, hold those in power accountable for how they're using science.
Oh, absolutely. And that engagement, it needs to happen everywhere, right? Like in schools, in research labs, in government policies. We need to build this culture of science that values, discovery, of course, but also ethics, integrity, a sense of responsibility. What are the consequences of this knowledge, of this power?
It's like that whole Spider-Man thing, right? With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
And science, come on, that's about as powerful as it gets. It has the potential to do so much good, but also so much harm. And it's up to us to make sure it's used wisely.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that's why stories like Stark's, they're so important. They force us to look in the mirror, to confront those uncomfortable truths, to really think about, the role of science in society. What are we trying to achieve? What kind of world are we building?
Big questions, for sure. But, as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and legacy of Johannes Stark, I want to leave you with this one. What kind of future do we want to create with the power of science?
That's a good one. And I really encourage everyone listening, if you're intrigued by all this, go check out Schneppat's essay, read the whole thing, dive into the history of quantum physics, explore those ethical dilemmas that have shaped its path.
It's a fascinating journey, and it's not over yet. Because the story of science, it's still being written. And we all have a part to play in making sure it's a story worth telling. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.